It gives me great pleasure to begin this session, and even more pleasure to introduce the first speaker, Rudolf Dorner, who's been an amateur astronomer for quite a long time. Again, I think he did the dip thing. He got interested when he was a teenager, I believe, even younger. And then you have to do other things, of course. You have to do other things, and then he got interested again. He also developed an interest and a taste for very fine optics, which is something it's something we all approve of, which has led him to want to do something else, and he's going to explain what that thing is.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Sure. My name is Rudolf Dorner, and I am an amateur astronomer, and I cannot be cured. So I'm pleased to take the next 7 minutes to talk about the new Telescope Museum of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, what it is and what it does. As Randall was saying, as a youngster in Kitchener, Ontario in the 1960s, the night sky was still black. On my 11th birthday, I received a 60mm department store refractor, like everyone else. One night, I aimed at a dim yellow star, and there, in the eyepiece, was Saturn in all its glory. I remember running around the telescope in circles. I was so excited, and I was hooked for life on astronomy and on optics. To me, it is magic, complete magic, that we have instruments for seeing things far away as if they were nearby. Now that's a direct quotation from Hans Lippershey's patent application of 1608 for the telescope. It is also magic that the telescope will reveal objects that we can't discern with our naked eye. Without this magic, our universe might still consist of 6 naked eye planets, some fuzzy objects, and the visible stars and nothing more. So that brings me to the reason for the museum. Its purpose is to document, to preserve, to display, and to celebrate the people and the telescopes which show us our universe. So I have charged the administration of the museum and the RASC to tell the story. You've heard of build it and they will come. Well, our mantra is tell a good story and they will come. To support this, I've donated $25,000 this year, and I will donate $25,000 of my very favorite dollars every year until I expire. And then the RASC will receive a legacy donation of $1.5 million to support the museum and to tell the story for a long time. Wait, there's more. Especially, I think it important to tell the stories of the Canadian telescope builders. I've met quite a number of them, and I know their outsized contribution to optics and astronomy, and it is woefully unrecognized. Let me give you a smattering of names of Canadian telescope builders. Stargazer Steve, Alan Ward, Norman Fulham, Peter Ceravolo. I would also add David Levy and Terence Dickinson, who, while not strictly telescope builders, have influenced optics and made outsized contributions to amateur astronomy. And I apologize for the people I failed to mention. So let me give you some specifics about the museum, what it is and what it does. The museum will be in the next location of the RASC headquarters, but it will be in its own dedicated space of at least 400 square feet. While the space is small, the museum will be artifact rich. It will be jammed with lots and lots of things to see and do. The museum will be hands-on, lots of things to touch and try. We have already purchased a working model of Newton's first telescope, and it will be on the floor for everyone to use. And if you stick pictures of the planets like this, on the far wall, and look through it through a scope such as Newton's, you will have much the same experience as Newton or other astronomers of his age. Now that's magic across 400 years. Let's also tell the story of Hans Lippershey, the spectacle maker and one of the first to build a telescope. In his honor, we should put out a selection of convex and concave lenses and let the curious try it for themselves. They will create their own magic, and I can report without a doubt that you look just as good up close as you do far away. The museum will always be free to both the RASC members and to the general public. We sometimes forget that even a small entrance fee can be a barrier to some people. The museum will be open Saturdays so that students and working people will have the opportunity to visit when they truly have time. The museum will provide a reason for members of the RASC to actually visit headquarters. I've been an RASC member for 40 years. I have never been to headquarters. The museum will have a website that is easy to navigate and displays every item distinctly, or tells every story distinctly. I've looked at a half a dozen museum websites, and I believe we can do better than that. I suggest we template our website after a high-end auction house. They have figured this thing out. In the auction template, each item is categorized individually, has a half a dozen clear pictures, a wonderful explanation, and an easy-to-use search engine. And as examples, I point out websites for the following auction houses: Invaluable Auctions in the United States, Waddington Auctions in Canada, and Bonham's Auctions in the UK. The museum will collect unloved telescopes. Volunteers will make them workable and give them to people, both young and old, with a keen interest in astronomy, but who are without the means to purchase a telescope. Finally, the museum will have a renowned archivist as its first director. Mr. Randall Rosenfeld will guide its creation and growth so that there will be academic rigor along with genuinely interesting displays. So, in closing, I believe it is my task and my privilege to give the museum a really strong push, both conceptually and financially. After that, it belongs to members of the RASC. I hope you will support it both in word and in deed. You may also want to consider a legacy donation, because there will never be enough money to do everything that is worth doing. But just as importantly, it is up to you to make known the historic stories that are waiting to be told. It's up to you to point out the historic telescopes and the historic artifacts that are waiting patiently in some attic to be rescued, to be displayed, and to be appreciated. The success or failure of this museum will ultimately depend on you. But with your help, this museum can become a source of great pride for the RASC. It will be a specialist museum, a focused museum, and perhaps even a world-class museum, unlike any other. And if you support it, perhaps it will become a must-see destination for every amateur astronomer in North America. And for that, thank you very much.
There we go, the beginning. Thank you, Rudolph. Right. Thank you, Rudolph. I don't know what to say, but I'm going to say stuff anyways. It would be difficult to find words to express my and the Society's appreciation for this. Without your vision, this just wouldn't happen. And some of you may be wondering, well, without your vision and the money, it wouldn't be happening. Some of you may be wondering what our preliminary ideas, now this is just really just got off the ground, what our preliminary ideas are. And I'm going to take you through those. This is all in flux. As I get oriented here. Oh, terrific. So, very obviously, the Dorner Telescope Museum is going to tell the story of the telescope in Canada. And that's thanks to this most significant donation the Society has ever received. This is the single largest, I believe. And this museum is very much going to be inspired by the vision of the donor. I was once told by a Benedictine abbess with a great sense of humor. She told me that the founder of an institution, of course she was thinking of St. Benedict in the 6th century, the founder's charisma, his charism, is one of these Greek terms, you could say the founder's spirit really does mold the institution. It doesn't matter if it's 1,000 years later or 100 years or even during the person's lifetime, at least that you can see, that their stamp, their idea really does mold it, because people will go back to that vision if they're looking for direction. So whether you like it or not, you're in that position as regards this. The museum's potential is very great, but it's up, as Rudolph said, it's up to us to take that from conception to reality. Now, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of the conceptual scaffolding, whatever that means, on which the museum will be built, its collections and collecting philosophy, its possible appearance, its goals and programs, and its place on the cultural landscape of Canada. So, general principles. Here it is again. Dedicated to telling the history of the telescope in Canada, never forget that the story makes the artifact, right? The objectives, and again I'm going over what Rudolph said in part: preservation and conservation of these instruments, research, effective display, education, but accessibility ought never to be bought at the expense, well actually that's, I've written that wrong. Accessibility ought never to be bought at the expense of dumb down. It means you've got to respect the artifacts you're dealing with, you've got to respect the actual history on the ground and the lives of the people who made these and used these. You also have to respect your audience, which means you don't give them pablum. You don't talk down to them. They're capable of more than you think, and we have to remember that. Next principle, the story makes the artifact. So what's going to be in there? It's going to have the representation of telescopes with outstanding optical mechanical characteristics. That's going to be really important, but they're going to be balanced by more accessible instruments. The 60 centimeter refractor, the 4.5 inch Tasco. There should be examples of that because it's what we all broke our teeth on. Probably the emphasis in the historic stuff should be from the great age of visual observation and the beginning of amateurs photographic work. So 19th up to the 21st century, the present. It should include, telescope museums got to include eyepieces, it's got a solar projection apparatus, some of the photographic stuff, so the associated artifacts. But also, it's got to have the stuff that represents the maker's lives there, that you hold up an object and you've got the story. You can make both what the person gave to the culture of astronomy and the object itself. You can illuminate it by referring it back to the person. So these artifacts associated with the people who made these things and used them. Late 19th, 20th, 21st century, but that's not where the collection should start. My prejudice is that it should start at the beginning, in the 17th century. We had Jesuits here. There were early telescopes here. That's the century of Galileo, and it's also the century of the Dutch patentees. And they've got to be remembered. Next thing, keep in mind, the story makes the artifact. If you see a recurrence, a periodicity here, It's there on purpose. Galleries should be artifact rich. That's a prejudice I have, which fortunately is shared by the donor. I do not like going into a large space with one artifact and a lot of interpretive panels. I think now there should be some interpretive stuff, and you got to know what it is, well, what the museum thinks it is, who made it, what it's made of, when it was made, and possibly a bit more about how it was used. The museum should be set up, it should be visually rich. It should be set up so that you can stand in front of a display or a case and actually do work just by standing there. You can, stuff you missed, you can always return to the museum. The responsibility is on you, the museum goer, to come with more of that interpretive material so you can do stuff with the artifacts. Oh my God, there's even more here. So, the question, what sort of telescopes should be in this thing, which is going to tell the history of the telescope in Canada? Well, chiefly astronomical telescopes. We have Galileo there saying something more polite than he originally said about what I just said. So, telescopes which are produced by Canadian makers, or people who do mounts. There are Canadians involved making superb mounts, eyepieces, I don't care. It's all part of this. They can be of international, national, or purely local renown. We probably all know people who don't have an international reputation who are superb opticians, or the person in your astronomy club. You've got a problem, they've got the experience, they know how to fix it. They may even have a trick to doing collimation. So any commercial telescope or accessory actually made in Canada, it's got a place. It should have a place. Telescopes which represent or incorporate Canadian innovation, so it could be manufactured somewhere else, right? Manufactured in the States, manufactured APM, whatever, in Germany. I also manufactured in China for the APM, but never mind that. But if it's got a Canadian innovation, that's also a relevant candidate. So, again, I've said this before, it should have representative types that were popular. It should also have at least, and telescopes representing all the periods, that there have been amateur astronomers in Canada. And it should have one department store junk telescope. I think we can find room for that. There's a lesson to be learned from that, several lessons, but many people started with that, and some people even managed to observe stuff with them. So there should be one. I don't want to be flooded with a bunch of these, though, even if they're gold-plated. Telescopes with which Canadians made significant discoveries, I'll take those. For instance, something that David Levy used to discover a comet. And I don't know if I'm giving away secrets. On the list that Rudolph, well, we each had respective lists about what should be in here. On both of our lists was the David Levy Comet Hunter. I was explaining this to David at a train station, not surprisingly, and before I even finished the sentence, he said, "Good, you can have mine," which we appreciate. Or if there's a Canadian amateur who's made a lot of high-quality variable star observations, someone like Rick Huziak, for instance, if he's finished with an instrument and wants to donate it, I damn well take it. I'm not having a good slide day, am I? Okay, so the terms which define what's eligible have to be elastic and flexible. By that, I also include anything I use here to define what's going to be in there. It should be flexible. That old Roman maxim, old Roman law maxim, going back to Justinian and his lawmaster Tribonian in the 6th century, judge each case by its own merits, is going to apply to artifacts. I mean, that's just reasonable. It makes sense. So because time's limited, 2 examples of what could be in the museum. those of us, people of my vintage or older, will very much remember the time when telescopes were very, very expensive. I mean, really expensive, and people, I believe, made a lot less money than they do now, in relative terms. There weren't that many choices if you didn't have a lot of money. 4.5 inch, 4.25 inch reflectors, small refractor, even a 3-inch refractor on equatorial mount was not a trivial expense for most families. What did people do? They learned to make their own telescopes. The amateur telescope making movement. Albert Ingalls, Russell Porter, and there were representatives here. Canadians took part in that. They were published in the Scientific American. The telescope making column that Ingalls ran, they went to Stellafane. They still do, thank God, like Alan Ward. So here's an example of one of those telescopes. 1929, H.L. Rogers. He's a Toronto Centre member. He was very successful in the real estate business. He apparently repaired violins as a hobby. That tells you something about the man if you can do that successfully. Became an amateur telescope maker. Apparently he produced very good optics. So here's one of it. This is 12-inch, so the main mirror is a 12-inch reflector. There it is. There's a picture. That picture, that's his son. That's a 12-inch telescope in winter, typical Canadian winter. Actually, it isn't. There's less snow than you'd expect. That's at least f8, and perhaps even longer. Apparently, the optics of the thing were very good. This was featured in the column in Scientific American in October of 1929 with that very photograph. You can also find this in the first volume of the Amateur Telescope Making series, which was sort of the Bible for amateur telescope makers. It's still in print. Wilman Bell has it in print. I don't like their arrangement of the articles as much as the old ones. This is a classic. This represents a period, a very long period in Canadian astronomy. And even professionals took this up. R.K. Young, the 19-inch at the David Dunlop Observatory, is a product of amateur telescope making. And it too is apparently quite a good instrument. Unfortunately, these instruments tend not to survive. If you know of any of these, I would be, Peter knows of one, and I think we may be getting a donation of something quite beautiful. In its appearance, it looks like a With reflector from the late 19th century England. But if you know of any of these and you don't want to keep them, I'd be very interested in hearing from you. So unfortunately, these things don't survive, but occasionally they do. That instrument does survive, that 12-inch by Rogers. Walter McDonald, are you here? Well, maybe Walter's with in the AAV. So anyways, so Walter's he's our webmaster. He was digitizing some of our stuff, putting it online. He read a reference of something from the Toronto Centre member, Joe Zaglinski. Joe's been a Toronto Centre member for a very long time. And he read that in the 1950s, Joe was here, U of T engineering student. He bought that telescope because it was cheaper to buy that telescope than to buy a cave, for instance, at the time. It was still in decent shape. He had Jerry Longworth resilver the mirror. Joe has kept the thing in pristine condition all this time. He said, and Joe confirms that the optics are excellent, and he's offered it to us, which I think is terrific. And there's a picture there of program. Joe's an engineer. He's working out the counterweights. And there's a picture of Joe from a few years back with the telescope as it appears today. Actually, it looks better than that because Joe's been doing work on restoring it. So that's one example. When I started, a 12-inch reflector was big. Well, when you guys started, when David started, who had a 12-inch reflector? A few people in your club. Another example? I love this. How many of you know, how many people here know that 3 very high-quality binoculars were actually made in Canada? I didn't know that. Rudolph knew that. So here's an example of one. Research Enterprises Limited. It's wartime. So all of the Allied states and the Axis states as well were, you needed ordnance, you needed armaments. The best way to have them was to make them yourself. You can control quality. Sometimes that didn't work as well as it ought to have. There was a real shortage. In both world wars, there was a shortage of optics. for the troops. So Canada decided to set up a plant to make binoculars and also sights for rifle scopes. Between 1940 and 1945, 6x30s and 7x50s were produced in Leaside. What amazes me is they even melted the glass there. Optical glass is made in Canada. I had no idea. So we one of our first acquisitions after the Newton telescope was a pair of these things. They're in superb shape. There's not a scratch anywhere on the lenses. They don't even. I got them from England because the Royal Army bought a bunch of them from us during the war. The pair we have is 1945. They're stamped. You can see it in one of the slides. The technology we use, we borrowed from Bosch and Lohm. We also borrowed some of their people, which is why the case, that's the original case. It's stamped Bosch and Lohm. So we got them from the UK. They're in superb shape. They don't have to be collimated. I'm just amazed by them. So what will the Dorner Telescope Museum look like? I haven't got a clue at the moment. There's some parameters have been laid down. Your resources and your ambition and your competence in planning, of course, are the things which generally determine what it will look like. The other important factor is other telescope museums. And we should take a look at those. I mean, why reinvent the wheel? So, here's one. Other telescope museums or museums that have large antique telescope holdings. This is the Whipple Museum of the History of Science in Cambridge, and I believe you were there, Rudolph, and you were very impressed. Limited space, they used it extremely effectively. Rob, I don't know, have you seen this museum? Oh, maybe not. I haven't been there yet. I'm going to have to get myself there. So this is one example. I just pulled these off the net. You can see they've off the net. They have some. They've got some 19th century refractors and some 18th century Gregorian telescopes. That I know. That's one example. Robert B. Ariel Collection of Historical Astronomy, University of South Carolina, has got Bob's collection of historic telescopes. He's one of the people who wrote that monograph on the Alvin Clark Company, and he had a lot of Alvin Clarks. They've got them there. There's that. There's a fantastic purpose-built museum of telescopes in the Netherlands. There it is, in Wassenaar. Anyone who's a Dutch speaker will cringe at my pronunciation of Dutch, so I apologize now. I haven't been there, but that's a place I want to go to. They even have, he's got an objective lens signed by Christian Huygens, which is sort of nice. With all the striations and bubbles in it, I still like them because they're visually attractive and they're important. Another example, Astronomical Lyceum in Magdalena, New Mexico, being put together and curated by John Briggs, and there's a picture of him there. John has got some astonishingly important. He's got the instruments used by Lewis Rutherford and people like that to make those discoveries and do the early photography. So, you get the idea. There are other telescope museums in the world with notable collections of astronomical telescopes and other fine optics. We can learn from them, we should learn from them, but there's a question. And we should send the director there one way or the other. He can paddle his way, work his way across to Europe, or I don't know. So, and there's a list of some of those museums. So the question is, we have these museums, they exist. What makes the Dorner Telescope Museum so special then? And it is. This is what makes it special. I don't know what's wrong with you people. You've never seen a beaver with a telescope? You don't get out enough. It's Canadian. As Rudolph said, it's going to tell the story of the fine Canadian astronomical optics in Canada. It's going to tell our story. I doodle, so that's how that got made. Goals and programs, and its place in the cultural landscape of Canada. To discover, record, and effectively present the history of the telescope in Canada from the 17th century to the present. Actually, I'd go back to the naked eye, because that's still an instrument which is current. Even if you're using digital data, you need the naked eye. And they influence the Canadian opticians, mechanicians, and their telescopes everywhere in the world. It's going to tell that story. It has to tell that story in an engaging way without sacrificing the integrity of the material. It will act as an inspiration to amateur astronomers, amateur instrument makers, perhaps even some professionals, and be a possible library of historical approaches to astronomical optics, which could be the seed of present or future innovations. It's funny, you see this occasionally. People think that the binocular telescope is a relatively recent invention, Jim's Mobile, for instance. It isn't. You can find binocular telescopes from the 17th century. You can find ones that look like the ones produced in the late 20th and early 21st century in the 1930s. There weren't a lot of them, so things we think are relatively recent may not be, and some of their aspects. This museum has got to avoid being a static, artifacts under glass only collection, and I mean, you made that absolutely clear. It should enable visitors and researchers to actually experience what it's like to use these instruments. Too often, you'll read an account of a past astronomer, Charles Messier, and the objects he's seen, and people criticize him for the objects he didn't see, or he couldn't resolve something. They immediately say, oh, well, look at the instruments he's using. They're actually subpar. They're the equivalent. His best instrument was the equivalent of a department store refractor. Is said and written by people who've never used good 18th century optics. I'll give you one example of this, of the opposite of this. Guido Horn de Arturo was a professional optician and professor of astronomy. This is the first half of the 20th century. He worked in Italy. He's the guy, one of the inventors of the segmented mirror. Well, they got, so the University of Bologna, they got a new observatory now the University of Bologna, I don't know if some of you have been there, I know Randy has been there. It has an 18th century observatory, it's still there, fantastic collection. In the 1930s, they got an outlier in the mountains with a new Zeiss reflector. He didn't bother ordering a finder for it because he had a 4-inch aperture finder. A superb 4-inch aperture finder, which was a Peter Doland refractor from the Peter and John Dolan refractor from the 1780s. And that 18th century, those 18th century optics, that objective lens, remained in professional service into the 1980s. I love that. I mean, you could use that. You could use an 18th century optic now to perhaps discover an exoplanet if you're lucky. You have the right algorithms and photon detector at the other end. So these things shouldn't be static. 2 minutes? Apparently I've got 2 minutes. Let's see how fast I can talk. Programs should be designed to further those goals, and that shouldn't be hard. If the Dorner Telescope Museum is done right, it will become a must-see destination on the itinerary of scientific tourism in Canada and for people who visit Canada from abroad. His generosity is going to significantly increase the RASC's cultural capital. This will be the only institution in the world whose prime mission is to tell the story of the telescope in Canada and the stories of the people who made and used them. And it's going to do this, and we're going to help this come to fruition because it matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of the RASC, the board, the centers, the members, to thank Rudolf Dorner for this donation and the suggestion that Randall be the first director of the museum was an excellent one, and I'm sure we'll do our best to. No, that's too late. He's already reneging. We'll do our best to make your vision a reality. Thank you. No, Randall, you're running this afternoon.
There's one final part to this. Yes. There's one final part to this, and it's a token of the Society's appreciation to Rudolph's gift to the cultural landscape of Canada, which, I mean, I'm serious when I say that. I want to see more museums. And a telescope museum, yes. I was talking about this with David. If we were 13, this is the sort of thing we'd want to go visit, as it is now, you know. So, as a token of our appreciation, the RASC is thinking, well, what can we give Rudolph? He's giving us 1.5 million. What can we give him in return? Well, we can make this museum happen. That's down the road. So, as a token of that, Chris, do you want to come up? So we're going to give Rudolph, in Rudolph's name, the RASC is donating to the museum one of those 3 binoculars. We have here the latest of the 3. This is Elcan binocular. It was made for the Canadian Army. Former Colonel Randy Bodum didn't recognize it because by the time he joined, they weren't using these, unfortunately. It's Ernst Leitz optics. Leitz optics. These are really good. Rudolph has a connection with these. Well, not this pair. Well, yeah, actually with this pair, because I believe one of the firms you were involved with was the only one which could produce the Prismhausens reliably to the tolerances required. And I mean, that's important, because your binoculars ain't going to work if that's not the case. I've used these things. Oh, they've got a range. Oh, yeah. Lens caps off. The first solar eclipse I tried to photograph. I thought it was great. I had a rangefinder camera. At the end, I was a kid. At the end, I realized I had the lens cap on during the whole thing. I don't still have the film. Oh, they're individual focus. Anyway, I don't know if they're close focus either. Anyways, I thought because Rudolph had a hand in this, industrially, I think it's the perfect gift to give to the museum on his behalf. I even promised we won't use your money for this.